All right, so I don't know if maybe you thought it odd, that I throw Augustine here and a little theology and how you want to change the world. But, I always think that, and I believe it's not just me, but it's a fundamental notion of most of what we see in the world as reality, our understanding of morality and ethics. I don't care what field you go into, the human person is the foundation of it. And you really need to have a solid foundation on that before you move on. So I thought, since I was already introducing you to the understanding how beauty is integral to the human person, I thought too that a sense of justice. Now, I guess we can make a lot out of the anecdotal evidence, but we thrive for justice almost in a very natural way. Children especially know when something doesn't look fair. They stomp their feet and they yell. Like, why is that? I mean, there's got to be something there. I guess we can, delve into the psychological aspects of it. But there's also maybe a sense that that's part of who we are as human beings. And some of the other thinkers that, relied more on memory and consciousness and such, I thought that was a little anemic as far as an understanding of the human person. Now, that's my personal flavor on it. But nonetheless, I try to at least be open so you see that. So we're back here to beauty in the human person, and can beauty save the world? All right. Now, I know I've probably said this a few times, but it's always worth reiterating that justice is like one of those words like love. It's one of those words like beauty. It rolls off the tongue. And if somebody pinned us down, like if we were on a game show and somebody said define justice, we might squeak out fairness, which is okay, but that's a little redundant. We'd have a hard time really pinning down what does that word mean. Just like we'd have a hard time pinning down, as I said, the phrase that we always use, I know. We assume everybody knows what that I as the self is. We assume everybody realizes what the epistemology is behind knowing is going to be identical amongst all of us. It's that way too with justice, all right? So this has been one of those things like beauty that the philosophers have been debating about since the earliest times. The Greek word there, dikaiosune, is what Plato will use for justice. Bumping ahead a little bit, you'll see in Christianity, where in the Christian scriptures, say the New Testament, where you see the word justification or righteousness. It's the same word, dikaiosune, right? So there's something to that word that the thinkers had to grasp onto. But he really sees this as it's giving another what is their due. Now that may not solve the riddle for us because what is due that person. But see, that's the interesting part, is that what's due a person has to be something intrinsic to their particular nature. Otherwise, how do you identify exactly what is their due? Now, he wasn't the only one, obviously, that had an opinion on this. As a matter of fact, Plato was having Socrates argue against other people who had competing, if you want to call that, understandings of what exactly we're talking about when it comes to justice. So I just, gave you three there. And this is a kind of like a lead-in to the paper, So Cephalus, he thought, well, if you were to ask me what justice is, says he, it's, whatever's proper to the other person. But there's an issue with that, because this could be in terms of evil and good. What if evil is proper to the other person? Then you'd almost have to make the case that it's then just to deliver that person evil. And this is directly connected to the understanding of the human person, because if the human person is based on some sort of perceptions we have, then we can actually perceive that that person might be do evil and then feel justified in delivering it to them. How many, regimes throughout the world have had this sort of opinion? That's the irony is that even somebody, I know I'm exaggerating, somebody like Hitler, he did not consider himself evil. They were working off of a sense of justice based on a recognition of what they held as the human person. So, Plato had something to say, against Cephalus on this. Now, Thrasymachus, he had a little different understanding, and he thought really that justice was something that belonged to the person with the power. So here you could really just understand it as, might makes right. That may sound rather odd to us, but if anybody's read like Machiavelli or anything in The Prince, or just, if you've watched any of those well, I guess like the Tudors or something, the divine right of kings. The understanding that there's some ordination of individuals over others, and that we actually have, in principle, a duty to do this. We might call it evil. You can almost see some of this in colonialism and imperialism, right? It's a sense that we know what's better for the other individuals, whether it's going to be a group or in a continent. Maybe some things good came out of that, but a lot of indigenous groups were almost wiped off because of this. Now, I'm not trying to play Monday morning quarterback, and we're not going to use our morality and ethics today and apply those to something that might have happened 1,000 years ago. But nonetheless, this is another person that Socrates is engaging. And he says, no, it has nothing to do with that. We've got to get back to what is to do with this person, right? So then you get to Glaucon, and you guys should remember, that individual. And he kind of thought that, justice is really a tool used by those who are weak to protect themselves from those who do have power. You can almost understand like John Locke's, the state of nature, where we come together as a group for the sake of protection, right? So the only reason, in other words, John Locke didn't have an understanding that we were naturally social beings, relational, but that the reason why we're in a relation, we're protecting ourselves from outside, forces. And there's something to that, right? I mean, we do come together to keep ourselves, safe, but that's not the sole principle. In other words, even if we were in a particularly safe environment, we still would be relational, according to many people's views of the human person. But here he's kind of saying this is why we come together. So justice really has to be put in place, and then we see laws and everything else. And behind all of this, I mean, there's so many ways you can go with this. Like I said, you could probably teach a full course on a lot of this. This understanding that, there is nothing neutral as far as ethics and morality and justice. Sometimes you'll hear, and I'm not speaking about any particular politician, they might say, I don't want to, that's my personal beliefs, but I don't want to impose that on others. Every single form of justice is in a position on someone else. It has to be. Every time that there's a speed limit that you try to take account of, or stop at a stop sign, there's some form of justice being imposed on you. You might accept it, but you accept it for the right order of traffic flow and such, and safety at the intersections. But you could pretty much say that I'm fully capable of determining a safe speed on the road. I don't need a speed limit to tell me that. And if there's nobody there, then why on earth do I have to stop at that particular red light? Some cultures don't do that, right? When I was in college, I got to be friends with 5 girls from Korea, and they asked me to teach them how to drive, so I did. Much to the peril of my mother, who was worrying about the car. But after I got them all through, got them all on licenses in Pennsylvania, within a week, 2 of them had tickets for running through red lights. And I said, why did you go through the red light? They said, well, nobody else was there. But apparently, I don't know if it's still true, they told me in their home country, that's how things work, right? So, nonetheless, these laws, my only point is there's always an imposition on something. So, there's nothing neutral out there, per se. So, when we talk about justice and then linking it to the human person, we're going to have to make that connection as to how central is this? And how central is the understanding of justice? Just like we would put up speed limits and stop signs and other traffic signs because we know something about the nature of driving and the nature of a vehicle, its ability to stop. I mean, cars don't stop on a dime, right? Which is why there's speed bumps and everything else to remind us of that. So they have to know something of the nature, the characteristics of the car for any of these laws to make any sense. Well, then we have to ask ourselves the question, are there any of those things that we could say about the human person? And then how is justice linked to that? And as I'm going to try to make the case, there's a very reciprocal notion between us and society, all right, in our understandings of the self. Now, here's the difference, I guess you can say, with Plato. Plato would say that one thing they've all gotten wrong is that they found justice to be something extrinsic to the human person, right? And you're going to see this more pronounced in Augustine. But remember, for Plato, the forms were these perfect, objective things, and justice is one of those. So there's a form of justice out there. We may only participate in it perhaps to a certain degree as we're maybe in the cave yet, but it's still very objective. But he says they're getting something wrong in all of this, right? In other words, everything. In other words, he would probably make the case that justice has a lot to do with us getting our emotions and other we have under the, let's put it this, whatever aspects of our human person should be governed underneath the form of reason, right? Like if I wanted to use more, like if this were theology, we talk about Thomas Aquinas, I talk about the irascible and unconcupiscible appetites and how our intellect has to govern those things and not vice versa, that type of thing. But they would have got that through all of this same understanding, but nonetheless. So if you remember right, think back to the Soliloquies. Augustine could not understand the human person outside of his God. And he even goes so far to say that we really don't understand God unless we understand something of ourselves, which is why he was delved in between reason and Augustine. He was having a soliloquy with himself. He's trying to get into his soul. So remember, for Augustine to find yourself, you're not out there. You're here, right? So it's almost like a centering thing. It's like look interiorly, and that's where you'll find the self. So he's, in his terms of justice, is not going to be something external. He's going to find something within the human person that warrants all of this, and he's going to make sense of it, per se. Any questions on any of that? It's kind of straightforward, but... So, let's just say that he finds justice as a virtue, and a virtue is a habit, and it's a habit that's in the soul. It's not necessarily an intellectual virtue, though it's also not necessarily just something visceral. It's one of the cardinal virtues. But you can see how, bless you, regardless of like exactly how we understand justice, if we were to have a conversation with Augustine and we were talking about the self, and we started saying that it was just a matter of memories and consciousness, you can almost see how he would start to come at that. And he wouldn't come at it because he's threatened by it. He'd come at it because he thinks it would be a poor understanding of the human person. So he would probably start to say, well, there's something other than the self. First of all, you're always in a relationship with your creator. Now, I understand if you don't have a theistic background, you don't have that. But he would even go farther to say that you can't really remove beauty or justice. All these things wind up being essential for the human person. And even like later writers, even more, maybe some in theology, you would see natural law formed from this, right? So the same way that a person has a natural inclination to preserve yourself. Well then, whatever your natural inclination is, there must be a duty. You have a duty to preserve yourself. Anytime there's a duty, there must be a right attached to that, because the right has to enshrine the duty. So if you don't have a right, if you don't have a duty, then you're going to have a hard time making the case for the right. So like I think I might have shared with you one time, I'm on a beach and somebody's walking around and said, hey, would you sign this paper? It's for the right to smoke, out in the open. You don't really have a right to smoke. You have a right to a certain level of autonomy, but I don't know if I'd go, but you couldn't call it a right to smoke. We could talk about animal rights, but maybe we might even start to be using the term analogously, right? In other words, you would just, if somebody were to say that they don't have rights, whatever to say, per se, that doesn't then mean that somehow the animal could be used willy-nilly. But what it's saying is that we have to try to find out, what would be inherent within that, as even an animal as we are, and then we move from that. So we have the right to preserve ourselves. We have the duty to preserve ourselves. There we have the right to life. We have the duty to look for truth. So there has to be some sort of right that gives us a basic education. It doesn't have to be secondary. It doesn't have to be collegiate, but at least it should be primary and secondary. That's just part of it. We have this inherent duty to be in relation with other people. It seems to be a natural inclination. Well, then people have the right to form organizations, be it communities, be it unions or whatever. That's how the whole thing works. But do you see, it all stems from the understanding of the human person. And if you change that understanding of the human person, which you're welcome to think for yourself on this, then you're going to have to find some other way to enshrine those. Which is why you would see somebody like, say, well, not Glock. I guess Glaucon and Locke, you would see them say, well, we need protection from other people. That's not based on the human person. It's almost based on a knee-jerk reaction. So you're still after the same type of good, but you're going at it from a different way. And that's not without its own problems, right? Because usually if you can't show something that's natural to the human person, you're going to have to say, then where comes the means to make sure that person has what they want? It's probably going to be somebody in power. Because not even a minority group, it's going to be the group that's in power that says, we think this is good for you. So it's an extension of oneself. And we may all agree with that. We might say, well, but I don't have a problem with what they're saying. Yeah, but that changes and power structures change. And regardless of what you may or may not think of the United States, we're not in a totalitarian regime. If you were, then you probably would not think that what they have to say makes sense. So anyway, okay, bless you. Now, we talked a little bit about this the other day, that what part of what we do when we try to understand who we are is, could we understand who we are apart from anybody else? What is their relationship to us? Are they just other mirror images out there? I think one of the philosophers, I think it might have been Scruton, that said like extreme autism has a hard time recognizing the others out there. So how do we then get a sense of justice in that understanding of the human person? And we're always going to be, to a certain level, in conflict with other people. Let's face it, there's things that we want that they want. And we don't have an endless supply of goods and resources. Even if there's enough, it doesn't matter if it's enough, people can always take more than they want, right? I don't know if anybody fought over, food at your Thanksgiving table, or like my son-in-law loved, my wife makes a peanut butter pie, and when he came the next day for the last piece, it was already gone. It didn't matter if he already had two, he wanted that third one, but my granddaughter took it, and I think he'll probably put her in a headlock next time he sees her. But nonetheless, so it's not always saying that there might be enough allocation out there for everybody, but that's not the way things work out. So we're always in this conflict. Not everybody can get into Villanova. I mean, the acceptance rate is X, and the number of people that applied are Y. So there's a lot of people that did not get in. There's a certain level, so whether or not you felt like you were in direct competition with somebody in particular, there was a sense that this is going to be a narrow field, okay? So we start asking ourselves then, what's our relationship to the other person? Because we're not all, we can't afford to be Mother Teresa's. It's not like, holding the door open and let somebody walk in front of you. It may not have behooved you. It may not even have been just for you to hold the door open and say, you can take my spot at Villanova, I'm okay. So we have to admit that to a certain level, we have to define what is our relationship with these other people in our world, if you want to say it that way. So the way Zizalus was, he said, we're going to really make sure that we don't conflate these two things. In other words, differences are a necessary distinction. And to be honest, they make us unique. And I think the more pluralistic a culture gets, I think the better off it is. We get intrigued with other people's cultures. We get enlightened by them, per se. And it also gets you out of your own little neck of the woods so that you see that the world's bigger than this, and things just, I don't know, it's good. But he was also very cautious to say those things cannot become divisions. At what point, now think of terms like how we as individuals with ourselves and what groups we identify with, and how far do we push that. I think I already shared with you, like the town that I grew up in, we had two Italian clubs, a Polish club, a Hungarian club, a Slovak club, and then one club called the Old Man's Club. I don't think it was just for old men, but I'm not quite sure what that meant. And my college professor, I took an interpersonal communications course, and he was asking me about this, and he was very adamant that he thought it was all terrible, unjust. He said, it sounds like everybody here has nothing but discriminatory. I said, well, how do you mean? He goes, you have to be Italian, you go to the Italian club, you have to be Russian, you go to the Russian club. And I said, well, so what? He goes, well, that's discrimination. I said, okay, anybody can go. It's just a matter of full membership. But, shouldn't people of like ethnicities or races, shouldn't they be allowed to celebrate their heritage? I think that's a good thing. It's not like they close off to the other people. It's just that they recognize, if it were, say, an Irish club, I don't think it would behoove them to have, 3 Italians and 2 Mexicans show up and say, hey, we want to tell you how things run here. Let them do it. up in New York when they have the Puerto Rican parade. I don't think they need the Italians to go in there and say, here's what we think you should do. Celebrate your heritage. I can't miss an ethnic festival. I'll tell you, if I'm within 50 miles and there's an ethnic festival, I'm there. I love the Polish ones because you can't beat, onions, butter, and dough. But that being said, you can't let these things become division. So even when we start, and you think of how do we identify the self with particular groups, and how far do we push that? So that was part of Zuzalus trying to say is that, this unity, the other person is necessary for us to be in relation with. And even these identities are necessary, but if they get to the point where they start to arise and cause divisions, then we are almost like thwarting, I can't remember exactly how he used it, but it's almost a disintegration or a decomposition. I think he used the word decomposition of personhood, and it starts to reduce us down. So that's the problem is and I know identity politics is a very loaded word, so there's a balance between identifying with a particular cause, race, ethnicity, and other things saying that you're not like us. You know what I mean? It's almost like there's something that happens in there, and then once you see that other person no longer is just another expression of your personhood, but as something in competing to your personhood, now the conflict arises and the division arises. If I think I have Zuzalus right with his understanding of that. So there's like a balance there, anyway. Now, Sartre, let's go back to the hell is other people. Maybe you can understand this a little bit better. Okay, so first of all, part of existentialism, these are probably the less favorable parts of it, at least according to this theory, is that it doesn't have, what do you want to say? It doesn't have an objective understanding of truth, right? So it doesn't have an objective understanding of self. Self is something that gets created, so the essence comes after a person's existence. So without that fixed understanding of truth, you're going to have to construct it, okay? Now that's not, there's some things that are obviously constructed within our understandings of truth and understandings of, it was interesting, I was listening to a podcast coming here this morning on culture and the arguments over what is or is not culture, and it was between, I would say like a Christian realist and a Marxist. And it was a nice debate because they were just talking back and forth, two guys sitting at a table. But this understanding of education and culture and what does it mean? Remember I said something about education should be at its foremost a propagation. So you take what the best has come before and look at it with a critical eye, but you can't just wash it out. But what happens is anytime you see a curriculum get narrow and get very specific, you're going to start to have to get your propaganda ears up, and think, what am I being told here? Because all of a sudden, like I've been in situations, and it can go either way. This isn't like a left-right thing, right? Where you're getting such specific, you don't get a good foundation. Like let's say we were to talk about epistemology like we did in this course, but I only ever gave you epistemology that came from the last like 30 to 40 years. I can do an entire course on that, and I can just call it epistemology, and I can base it in critical theory and all that. And we have done epistemology, but you got a very, very narrow view of it. Rather, what I tried to do was there's a little bit of Plato, there's a little Socrates, a little bit of Aristotle. So even when I did it the human person, if some of this stuff didn't seem right for you, that's perfectly fine, because that's what education is supposed to do, right? It's not supposed to deliver something, wholesale to you and that you just accept. But it's supposed to give you the tools so that you can move on, which is why when you hear, again, somebody might say, well, the humanities are kind of useless, say yes, absolutely. They have to be, because the minute that something is utilitarian, like even a business school, that's a modern notion for a university to have. I'm not saying like it's modern in the last 10 years, but you wouldn't have found something like that 100 years ago. They would have found that to be much more vocational. They would have said, well, the same thing with, doctors, lawyers, all those things. You go and you get the broadest undergraduate, foundation that you can, and then with that, now you go. Go into law school, go into med school, go into business school, go and be a janitor. They all have the same basic foundation, but as the modern universities are really the reason why you have to declare your majors when you're still a sophomore in high school. It's because they have lumped so many things that are required within that major. Even when I went to school 30 years ago, by the second semester of the junior year, you had to declare. Think of that. Could you imagine that? You wouldn't graduate, what, 5, 6 years, right? So there's all that much more putting it in, but we've kind of lost in education this understanding of apprenticeship. It used to be that a lot of that stuff was done in the field, and now it's kind of like done here. Now that's all perfectly fine. I'm not here to debate, whether or not that's advantageous, but it does have an effect basically on like how specific we try to get with the information that we give the students, and what the curriculum is. So a curriculum is a form and a way of propagating a particular agenda. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but we have to at least understand it that way. So that way you know about it and you can kind of think about it and figure it as you go through. Okay, a little bit of an aside there anyway. Now remember, Sartre, the reason why the other person, everything was about freedom, all right? So you have to be able to freedom and make these decisions. And what the other person can do is the other person has the ability to objectify you. So that was kind of that phrase I gave, like looking through the peephole, that voyeurism. You can look in and you can objectify that individual. So he talked about it in terms of the phrase the look, right? I mean, you could always be objectified by another individual. So in that way, that person could be a limit on your own freedom. Now, this is not a course in existentialism, and I may not be doing it justice with a little bit I'm talking about it, but it's going to affect how you understand the human person. I'm not going to tell you good or bad. All I'm going to say is you need to know that it has an effect. Because if there's nothing else that comes out of this course that I would love for you is that you realize there's nothing neutral here, and you're going to have to form your understanding on how I know, on what's real, and what the self is. You have to come up with those things one way or another. You let them slide, there's nothing by default. What you'll have by default is a smorgasbord of contrasting things that as long as you don't ask good hard questions, you can go through life, with your, I don't want to say like in a mean way, with blinders on, because you've never dealt with the internal contradictions within your own thought. That's kind of what philosophy has the ability to do. It levels all that out, and that's why I think the allegory of the cave never loses its appeal, because it's easy to get somebody to understand that they're in this darkness yet. You may not be chained to the wall, but things are dim, and it's difficult for us to really look through this, and you might need a guide. In other words, again, that's what education's supposed to do, drag somebody out. When you drag them out to the forms that are there so that they can make some sort of assessment on their own, rather than saying, here's what you should think. So read G.K. Chesterton, he's my favorite. He talks about, again, propagation. I guess that's C.S. Lewis, propagation and propaganda. So then, what could this mean then for justice? Maybe all you can really say, because since essence comes after existence, and we're all not going to have the same essence because we're constructing it to a certain degree on our own, then we can't really say that this is good for the individual, this is due the individual. We're almost going to have to come into some reciprocal type relation. In other words, it's okay, like when we want unity, there's different ways you can come together to be unified. You can be unified in a very noble way. So in other words, we're all from one race, and I won't recognize anything but the human race. And I recognize all the dignity based on the fact that you're a human individual. That's a good way to do it. That's very noble. Then there's another way where we almost are making some concessions in a plurality, right? Like we realize that there's a lot of differences amongst us, and maybe what I could do is try not to impose on your differences, and you try not to impose on my differences. And that kind of works in another way. But then you have the other way where it can lead straight to division, because you see the other person as a flat-out restriction on whatever it is freedom that you want, okay? So what are you going to do here with justice? Maybe you're going to have to almost, he's not doing the same as like a Lockean agreement, like I won't interfere with you, we'll come to a social contract, but there's something to it there, right? Like he would say too, and this is where the good part of existentialism, like don't let other people define you, right? That's part of the concern about the other. So you're not whatever they do. That's the look. So whatever they might look at you, if they put you in a particular race or ethnicity or mental level, that's not important. You come at that through your own freedom. So if any of you do get a grade that you don't particularly like, and you go home for Christmas and your parents are like, "What do you mean you got a C?" Say, "Please, Mom, don't put me into some Sartrean or Lockean objectification. See how that works for you, and then if it does work, let me know." But nonetheless, so this is what he means. You have to read or watch. I don't know if there's a a dramatization of his play, No Exit, but that's where this comes from. Okay. Now here's the thing. Just like Augustine understood that you can never understand the human person outside of their God, we're going to have to concede something that I don't care how you want to work it, the human person and our understanding of ourselves are always going to be in a very, let's use the word, in a very symbiotic relation with our society and culture. You know, so many things that, you know, you might just sense are perfectly normal right now, you're going to realize in 30 years when your kids tell you how old you are and ask you if there was actually black and white TVs when you were a kid, you're going to realize how you're outside of the culture now. And then you almost have a critical eye. Not that you can't do it at your age. It has nothing to do with an intellectual ability. You just need some experience to start to see the differences, right? So, you know, we have to understand that in some way that the selves are, the culture is a bunch of selves collective, right? So you have the self who sort of, you know, lays out some sort of influence to the culture, and then the culture is going to then return that particular reflection back to the individual. So think back to some of the understandings and some of the criteria we had for the self from other thinkers. Could you imagine if you thought that you were simply just a matter of your own memories and stuff, then what could possibly be society except a projection of your own psychological, you know, continuity? I mean, it can't be anything else. And if you think that that's a real narcissistic person, because it is a narcissistic person, but it's not just a narcissistic person. How many times I catch myself, and if you be honest with yourself, how many times do you think that this whole world is really a movie or a story and you're the star? And everybody else around you is supporting actors and actresses. I mean, we'd never be so crass to say that, but sometimes we kind of think that way. You know, I know we use the phrase the world revolves around us, but let's not be that crass. Let's be a little more reflective and critical. There's times that we don't see the other person in the way that we would still see ourselves. In other words, they're kind of like here, they're the supporting actresses, and I'm the star in this particular show. That comes from that idea that the psychological identity is the locus of the person, and then what happens out in society is they just become evaluated in terms of how they fit into our stories. So you could see, again, this is what I'm trying to just drive home, is the understanding of the self is something that's primary. Zozilos would step all over that and say, are you kidding me? You know, you can't even understand yourself outside of those other people. You know, how can you possibly think you're the center of anything? The human person, maybe we'll talk about the human person as the center, you know, of some exceptional animal here on the planet, but that's as far as we'll go. So there's a different, and we're going to see on Monday, even like, you know, it's not just a Christian thing, you're going to see in the African culture how they've sustained parts of that. And there's a lot of other cultures that do it. We could have picked all kinds of things, right? Nonetheless. So this is the bottom line that I guess I'm trying to get at with this, is that, and I'm not making fun of any movements that are going on, social justice movements, because there's a lot of good things. But if you start to look too closed in as your group, then you're going to start to look at the needs of your group over the needs of others. And at that point, then because of your understanding of the human person, your understanding of the locus of the identity of who you are as the self, now you got to admit you're starting to see the other people as competing with what you are. And justice is only going to be determined by how they fit in with your understanding of justice. In other words, this is just that we do this. Yes, but you know, think again. I know it's a crass way, and I'm not here to bash neoliberalism, but you know, imperialism and capitalistic movements onto other nations, you know, is a really easy, clear example of that. It's one group imposing something on the other because of how they identify the self. Even if, you know, let's face it, you know, as much as I'm not an American basher, I like the fact that democracy has gone elsewhere in the world. I don't always like how it's gotten there sometimes, right? Oftentimes our commercialism and our crass consumerism is what really brings down other cultures. You know, if you can't get missionaries into a particular country, let's just send them McDonald's. And then within a generation, we've got them anyway, you know, that kind of thing. So, you know, we have to understand that if this is going to be our sense of the self, and we're almost seeing like a Sartrean reciprocation, we're going to have to say, you know, how does that person fit in? Because my sense of justice is based on what my particular group needs. Because I don't have that idea like either we looked at in human nature, or either in Zozolos, where you can't see the other person outside of yourself. There is no other, I mean, I don't care what race you're talking about. This is the human race. It's the humankind, and we're all there. But you need to have some sense of the human person that fits into that. If not, it's going to fall into one of these categories. And this stuff sneaks up on you. You have to be a very reflective person to pull this out. And you'd be amazed at how often it can catch up. Even like when I'm untuned on this, right? And sometimes I'll be in conversation, another philosopher will say, what did you think about this? And like, you know, I didn't. That's pretty interesting. Now you say that, I didn't realize that's another aspect or another attribute of this, okay? So then we come down to the article here with Augustine, and he has these two, if you ever read The City of God, the city of God is where justice is perfect. If you need to think in a philosophical context, think of you're outside the cave in the forms. They're all good. But we don't live in the city of God, we live in the earthly city, and things are not good here. So, just like going back to Christian scriptures, if we're going to say that when God created this, he said it was good, again, he meant it was good, beautiful, in right order, as it should be. Things are not good, beautiful, in right order, or as they should be. How do we get there? It's going to be a hard thing to do if you don't have a foundational understanding of what is the self and what is the human person. He's going to say that what we have here is really all the injustices that are coming are a misuse of power. And remember, power is going to be the control of somebody's will over another. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to, nobody, even if you watch like, Austin Powers, Dr. Evil is not Dr. Evil. What he thinks what he's doing is good. I know probably not in the sense of the joke, but everybody is trying to impose something on another person. But that's a projection of your own psychological continuity you think should exist elsewhere. It's not an understanding that that person's on the same plane and plateau as you. So the concept of self is going to really affect, issues of power, conflict, and how you see the other person, all right? And you can't get away from these, which is why maybe like with Parfit and those other guys, I didn't give you a lengthy exposition on those. Maybe we could have showed a little bit more how they're not outside of relationality any more than Sartre would be outside of relationality. But the relationality is going to be much more contractual and less based on something that can be determined to be within the human self. Okay? And that's my only concern, is that once you make something that's contractual, you're going to have to ask who has the power to form these contracts. Now, we may like that, right? Where, like I was giving a lecture this morning, we were talking about the effects of global warming on other countries. You can have whatever your opinion is on global climate change in the United States. You can pretty much do nothing. In the next 10 years, your life's perfectly fine. You're going to have all the water you want to drink. You're going to have all the food you want to eat. But if you're in a developing country, it's probably not going to be the same thing, right? So you think of what would we do if we overplayed our sense of self-preservation and we wouldn't see the other person as the self? You can talk about this in immigration. I mean, all of a sudden, the other person becomes a competitor for something that we might say is limited resource. Even if it isn't limited, it's just that we want 3 pieces of peanut butter pie. We want more because we're used to having more. And we don't know how to live otherwise, right? That type of thing. So he goes and talks about the Commonwealth. So do we know what a wheel is? The wheel of the people, right? Make sure there's nothing particular I wanted to make sure to hit with you guys. Okay. Well, we're really just talking in a sense about the common good. But when you use the word common good, like you hear a lot of politicians say that, right? Like, I'm here for the will of the people and the common good. But how can you say what's good or common if you don't have an understanding of the self? I mean, okay, once we get past basic shelter and basic food and basic health care, once we get past those, primitive Maslowian needs, what else is out there, right? What else is out there? So Augustine went against Cicero and said, no, there has to be a common object of love, which we don't have time to get into, but that would be a whole nother aspect of an element of the human person. Because his idea is that we all have a love of things, and a love of someone. That's something that's common amongst us. It's just we'll have to determine what that definition of it is. Interesting enough, this is not maybe the best definition, but it's a Thomistic definition of love, is to will the good of the other person. So whatever is best for you, the only way I can love you is to will that for you and help you achieve that. which means then that hate is not the opposite of love. Because if you're in a particular relationship with somebody and they hate you, you are still communicating. Absolute difference of love is use. Because if the love then is to will the good of the other person, and the opposite is to use you for my will. So when you use somebody, you're doing the opposite of love. We'd have to understand how does that fit into the human person too. But that's for another day. So the bottom line is that with Augustine, he's making the case, and you notice the article kind of was aimed at undergraduates, right? Which is probably why I thought I'd use it. The problem is not out there somewhere. It's much more interior, right? Part of our issue in the world is that we see all threats exteriorly. And a lot of times that is a threat, which is an understanding of the self, because we have to keep our, like, you see like Sartre and Locke, we've got to protect ourselves from the outside. So when 9/11 happened, I remember exactly where I was. I remember I was in the post office, and I walk in, and they had a TV on the counter, and 2 postal workers and 3 customers were watching the TV, and I'm always an idiot, so I made some joke about, government workers or something, and then they showed me one of the towers were hit. Well, it took about 30 seconds for that to absorb. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Well, I quick ran home and got my wife and a few employees we had down at the shop, and I said, get up to the house, and we got up there and then watched the next one. Okay, so that was an external threat to the United States. Let me tell you, in the few weeks that followed, there wasn't a single person in this country that was not a patriot. Everybody, flags. I mean, you went up down the street, everybody had American flags all over the place. Okay, so in a sense there, you see how that congealed us and brought us together in a sense of unity. But what if the threat's really an interior one? What if that's the threat to disunity? Then that's what Augustine's getting at here, is that, what we really are after, if we're after justice, it's something with the interior person. It's the right order of one's own self. We can almost think about, go back to, if you want to use scripture, he's a Christian, you go back and talk about tov, good, not in the right order. Now it's to be put back into right order, that type of thing. And the concern then, and this is always my wish, I know it sounds corny, but I would love it if you guys change the freaking world. And whatever particular passion you have, don't lose an ounce of it. Whatever aspects of your person that is very idealistic, don't lose an ounce. But if you don't have a sense of the human person that's going to make you accept that there's only so much I can do, you're going to be burnt out real quick, right? Especially if you go into anybody that's going in a caregiving field, you're going to learn that. It almost sounds like if you're going to be taking care of an individual who's in need of, let's just say, hospice care or such, doing it over a length of time will burn you out. Well, okay, let's just bring that into society. If we have a sense of that we all want justice, everybody wants justice, once we determine what that is, we're going to determine what that is in lieu of our understanding of the human person. And then once we do that, we're going to realize, according to Augustine, that that really only exists perfectly in the city of heaven, but we're on the city of earth where I don't have it, but I still want justice here because we want peace, and you can't have peace where there's no justice. If you don't understand that in the fight, you're going to be burnt out quick. I just think the sense of self kind of lays into all that. That kind of makes sense. Well, I was on my soapbox today, wasn't I? All right.